Hello and welcome to the country. My name is Justin Weller. Thanks so much for joining. We've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to talk about a white swan that's coming for your nest egg. We're going to talk about the toxic state of racial politics in America. But we're going to begin today with a question. And the question is this: why do we need a Republican Party? They don't cut profligate spending or balance any budgets. They don't protect our rights or our border. They don't stop inflation or corruption. So I really wondered tonight, for the country, what is it that they do? We've written and talked recently here about the reasons Kevin McCarthy, in our mind, didn't deserve to lead House Republicans in Congress. He's in fact a darling of K Street lobbyists. And he did nothing to fix the broken workings of Congress in his 9 months of leadership. We still don't have an appropriations bill for any departments. I don't blame the man personally. He's a captured creature of the dirty, deep state workings of the federal government that works solely to enrich elite and entrench interests to the detriment of the people, our livelihoods, and our future. There was hope, though, that after his ouster, Mr. McCarthy, congressional Republicans in particular and conservative leaders in general would view this as a wake-up call. Enough. Here and no further. This is a time for a sea change in which the people win back the people's house and their government. Instead, what we've got over the past 2 weeks is typical Washington bullshit. I'm sorry, but there's no other word for it. We have watched the Republicans meander about directionless as various interests compete for power's sake. None of these so-called leaders have the people in mind. So let's talk a little bit about things we don't need. The American people do not need a speaker so that they can send their blood and treasure to Ukraine and Israel. Ukraine should be supported by Europe. It's a European issue. And Israel, while we should lend the support that we are militarily, they have no need for some financial support. They can support themselves. Second, the American people do not need a speaker so that Republicans can save face in their never-ending struggle to win cheap theatrical points against their Democratic rivals in Congress. Likewise, the American people do not need a speaker so that the Republicans can save face in their never-ending struggle to win cheap theatrical points against their Democratic rivals in Congress. No one cares. The American people do not need a speaker so he or she can push through another continuing resolution or an omnibus bill that locks in $2 trillion in deficit spending, that locks in uncontrolled inflation, and that continues crony government and corporate graft. We would rather the government just close until such time as a balanced budget amendment can be passed. The American people do not need Jim Jordan, further, to change the tax code so he can be the speaker. You may have seen this story. He offered to change the SALT tax for New York representatives if they would vote for him. We do not need that. And we do not need to subsidize profligate spending in New York State. They're due for a $9 billion budget deficit this year. There are things we need that no U.S. congressperson has delivered. For all of their talk, not one of the issues that are most important to the American people are being resolved at all in Congress. So let's take a look at the list. Congress has not passed a single appropriations bill before the October 1st deadline since 2019. That's 4 years in a row, including none this year. The former speaker promised to fix this, Mr. McCarthy. Meanwhile, the national debt is $33 trillion and a staggering 120% of GDP. Every member of Congress, current and past, is wholly responsible. And as an aside, I know my friends on the left like to blame the Trump administration for $8 trillion of deficit spending over 4 years. That is accurate. It's close to $8 trillion. What isn't mentioned in that figure is that $5 trillion of it was pandemic spending in the last 2 years of his administration when we had a Democratic Congress. Those bills were passed by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer in response to COVID. Here's another thing we don't need, or that hasn't been solved, I should say. The annual deficit this past fiscal year was around $2 trillion, the highest ever, except for the first COVID pandemic year, this one I just mentioned. And the CBO projects it will remain that high for the next decade, $2 trillion every year for the next decade. Speaker McCarthy and the Republicans in Congress, and McCarthy was the minority leader when they passed all those silly spending bills, presided over this profligacy. Another thing they haven't done, there has been no vote in Congress for a balanced budget amendment. I propose we shut down the Congress and the government until they do so. And in fact, Kevin McCarthy promised it. The continuing resolution that recently passed, and that was so cheered by many, locked in that level of spending, $2 trillion in deficits. It also added some more. Wasn't that nice? What else don't we need? We don't need inflation continuing at historic highs. I just wrote an article. I did the math. The latest inflation number was 3.7%, which sounds, hey, that's so much lower than 8%. It's still 85% higher than the historical average and the Fed's target of 2%. And it means that the dollar that you held in 2020 is now worth 84 cents, just 3 years later. And if your monthly expenses were $5,000 in 2020, they are now $5,950, a $1,000 increase in 3 years. Another thing they haven't fixed, there were 2.7 million encounters of illegal aliens at the southern border in fiscal 2022 and will likely top 3 million in this past fiscal year. A vast majority of them were released into the United States. Another thing they haven't fixed, we've spent $113 billion in Ukraine, which bought us 500,000 dead and a stalemate with no end in sight. There's no plan to win, exit, or stop funding this useless war. Here's another thing they didn't fix. Healthcare costs continue to skyrocket, with family premiums moving from 11% of average income in 1999 to 24% in 2020, the last year I could find a figure. So our bend the curve, Obamacare, cut costs, help the average American out, didn't do any of that. And please don't talk to me about Medicare for all. Medicare's costs go up just as fast. Another thing they didn't do is Congress, despite promises, continues to fund speech regimes at the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies that engage with big tech to demand censorship of citizens' speech. What else haven't they done? No one has been held accountable at the FDA or within the government for lying to doctors that opioids like OxyContin are non-addictive. The opioid crisis continues unabated. No one has been held accountable at the CDC or otherwise for lying to the American people about the risks of the COVID vaccine. No one has been held accountable at NIH or NIAID for funding gain-of-function research that likely created the COVID virus and escaped the lab in Wuhan. And they covered both of those things up. For that matter, only one banker, whom no one has ever heard of, has ever been held accountable in government or private sector for the fraudulent selling of synthetic and high-risk securities that caused the financial meltdown of 2007 and 2008. So is it time for a new party? For all of the above reasons, I really can't think of a reason to support the current congressional Republicans. Nor can I think why it matters who the next speaker is. Perhaps a new party dedicated to the principles of Lincoln and Kennedy would do the people some good. Perhaps it will force the globalist warmongering uniparty in Washington to start listening to the American people and their needs. I suspect my friends on the left would do well to create a fourth, more progressive party for their own sake. You look at the Squad and many of the progressive folks, they never vote against the Democratic Party. Is no one frustrated with that? Certainly, RFK Jr. is. He was forced to leave the Democratic Party as the party elites worked at every turn to lock him out and thus enforce the status quo of Joe Biden leadership. That doesn't make a lot of sense for my progressive friends when 75% of them, according to a CNN poll, want someone other than Joe Biden as their nominee. One thing is clear, though. The status quo serves very few. We need a major course correction before this country continues its current course to more war, more debt, more poverty, and ultimately the dustbin of history. We move on. Our crack-riddled economy is still recovering from addiction, with the effects of detox still expected to cause pain. After an unprecedented stretch of 15 years of free money and debt accumulation, we've entered a new period of high interest rates, What many may not be considering is how much low interest rates created perverse incentives for both personal and business finances and government, especially in regards to risk. We are in for a reckoning. Since the COVID pandemic erased a humming economy and spending in Washington accelerated to close the gap, inflation has reared its ugly head for the first time since the 1970s. It's been very, very high historically compared to history since it began to rise in January of 2021 and remains 85% higher than its historic average, coming in at 3.7%, as we mentioned previously. According to the website In 2013 Dollars, inflation has increased 19% since 2020, an amazingly high number historically. This means the dollar you had in your hand in 2020 is now worth 84 cents, as we talked about. And if your monthly expenses were $5,000, they're now $1,000 more. Recent US dollars inflation adjusted rate, even worse. Although the economy is growing, a significant portion of the growth is government deficit spending, which is an unsustainable model for economic prosperity. According to macro trends, the national gross domestic product has risen from $21.4 trillion in 2019 to $25.5 trillion in 2022, a healthy growth of $4.1 trillion in new economic activity. But over approximately the same period, because the federal government works on October fiscal years, and the GDP data is calendar. But approximately the same period, the U.S. federal government outlays increased from $4.4 trillion in 2019 to $6.3 trillion in 2022, a $1.9 trillion increase, according to data I downloaded from the OMB at the White House. This means that approximately 45%, or 1.9 trillion of the 4.1 trillion total, 45% of the GDP growth over this period was simply government deficit spending, which will serve to increase the debt, increase the amount the federal government has to pay on the interest to that debt, and will cause more inflation as the Treasury and the Fed are forced to print new money to enable this profligate spending process. We wrote about this incestuous and appalling details of deficit spending and inflationary moves by government at The Country. You can find it at thecountry.news. It's very much not good for the people. But besides inflation, deficit spending and debt service, which will become so much more costly as interest rates have risen and stay high, the biggest indicator of a looming recession is the state of real estate prices and debt in America. Nassim Taleb, who is famous for predicting the 2007-08 financial crisis, and who authored the book The Black Swan, which means, every swan is white, and so you make assumptions about white swans until you run into a black one. He predicts that real estate, startup funding, and the stock market will be the next crises. They will drive them. And the impacts may be as big as the 2007 crisis. Let's go ahead and listen to an interview he did on CNBC back in the summer.
We are joined by a very special guest who's here to talk about the markets, a Universal Investment Scientific Advisor, Nicholas Nassim Taleb is here. He's the author of The Black Swan. We always love seeing you.
Yeah,
nice to see you, by the way, in person at the table. I don't know if we've seen you in quite a while.
I came here before, but,
yes.
But it's nice, to see stability. I've known you guys.
We are a one sense of stability.
10 years, 15 years?
Yep.
11 we've all been together.
In a less stable,
time.
I think a dozen years now.
Oh, yeah, it's 12.
A dozen
Kyle's
years
turning
now.
12. I base it all based on when my son was born.
So help us, though, talking about stability and risk.
Yes.
Where do you think we really are in these markets? We've had Barry Sternlicht come on and just tell us that the Fed doesn't know what it's talking about and that actually things are much worse than we know.
Let's talk a little bit big picture, okay? 2008, we had a debt problem. No? The Fed put the interest rates at zero for 15 years. Now, lowering rates to zero made no sense. They didn't try, they panicked, they didn't try to lower it to 3%. They went all the way to zero. And once it's at zero, it's very hard to raise it.
Right.
So now we're going to have to learn to live in an environment with higher interest rates. And 15 years, that's a generation of traders, a generation of finance practitioners who don't know what interest rates mean. So welcome to a new era. So new era is we have more debt than we did before. The Federal Reserve's primary job is price stability. And monetary policy is something that is, short term. They used that tool
Right.
in place of a structural reform. You see, you can't use, it's not made for that. So that's a big mistake, and we're going to pay the price because we have a lot of debt.
When does that price come? What does the price look like?
I don't know when it will come, but let's look at what we have. It's more than $100 trillion of real estate valuation. Okay, we're not at 3% mortgages, we're at 7% and going north. Okay, so, and you have a lot of the methodology of the startup business changed. In the past, they used to be selling you a future cash flow. Now they're selling you future funding, like you're going to sell it to someone else. So the whole structure needs to tumble. Okay,
it needs to tumble.
Yes,
like tumble 2008 style tumble.
Probably because systems don't correct themselves without some kind of a little bit of pain.
So you think a true crisis is coming?
The risk is right there. Okay, we know we have real estate valuation that don't make sense with interest rates, short-term rates at 5.25%. We have startups that basically were using the funding market to as cash machine, and it's not sustainable. The stock market is another story because the stock market seems to have some. It's probably more robust than the others.
This doesn't even sound like a black swan event. This sounds like a
white swan. It's a white swan.
You're saying
event.
it's right in front of us.
The risk is in front of it. You see a fragile bridge, all right? The bridge that's fragile. Okay, it's going to collapse at some point. Okay, so you need to fix it. How do you fix it? You got to reduce debt. You got to do a lot of cosmetic things that are not cosmetic, actually. Sorry.
If you don't believe in MMT, the binge that we had at zero was much larger than any binge we've had in the past. If you really do believe in comeuppance or hangovers, however you want to characterize it,
exactly.
we haven't had it because this has been the mother of all binges, but we haven't seen it. There are people, Nassim, that they argue with me all the time that the strength of the dollar, that they don't think it's ever going to change. So we're able to print. We're the country of record on the entire planet. We have this ability to print that's never going to go away, so we can spend as much as we want. That's the MMT people.
No, MMT made no sense, but people bought into it because it was
you can make a case for it because we can always print money because we are the dollar is the standard for the world.
Yeah, the Germany was a power, okay, and they printed, okay, so it's not like
we've seen it. I know they seem to ignore history.
They don't have history.
I sent them a picture of a wheelbarrow full of cash when they argued.
Though, to the extent you're right. And one of the things you did ahead of 2008 was you hedged. The question is, if you were an investor today, given this fragile bridge, what would you do?
It depends. If you can't tail risk hedge, which is, I'm not going to sell tail risk hedging because
you can. You can try to sell tail risk hedging if you'd like.
But if you're an individual, you have to be stay away from the two businesses you're going to stay away from. New technologies, okay, particularly the ones that are connected to AI, because it's going to be very unstable, and the other one is real estate. And if you're a professional in the market, make sure you're not naked long stocks.
Right.
So one day here, we'll figure out how to not have our screen mirrored in OBS, which is the capture software we're using. So if somebody knows how to fix that, please drop it in the comments. I'm embarrassed to say I've spent 20, 30 minutes trying to fix that, and I still get that mirrored video. So apologize. Anyway, Taleb's main concern center on two real issues. First, the real estate prices have not dropped in any meaningful way, despite the costs of a mortgage and other financing options for commercial real estate costs doubling. So typically, you see this thing where if mortgage rates go higher, prices come down. And then as mortgage rates go lower, as we've seen in the past 15 years, prices tend to rise. But the strange thing is we still have historically high prices. There was a slight dip when I expected it, when the inflation thing first started in 2021. But then they've come back, and they're higher than they've ever been. So something strange is going on there. I think potentially banks are holding a bunch of mortgages and other commercial assets, real estate assets that they haven't marked to market, and they're actually insolvent, and something's being hidden there. As he says, mortgage rates have increased from 3% to 7%. Prices should have fallen significantly, and they haven't. What he didn't mention in that interview, again, is perhaps the reason behind this. Many banks hold loans and other financing instruments that these real estate properties that would be insolvent where the property is marked to market if you were an appropriate price. You've probably forgotten already, I did, but the troubles earlier this year, around March, April timeframe at Silicon Valley Bank and other small regional banks, that was what that was, commercial real estate. Wall Street has been warning since then that there will be a correction. And as Taleb says, quote, "This system needs to tumble. Systems do not correct themselves without pain." I will say, too, that after this, and since this interview aired, again, I can't remember, June, July, maybe timeframe, I've been short real estate. And I also got out of NVIDIA. I made some money on NVIDIA when that started with the AI craze, and I got out. I don't understand their business or why everybody's buying their stock. And it sounds like another bubble, an AI bubble. It seems like everything that is computing, people now call AI. I watch CNBC a lot, and every CEO comes on there and says, "We're using AI to do this, and we're using AI to do that." It's sort of like cloud computing was. It's just a buzzword that really means nothing. AI just means people aren't doing it, I think is really what they mean to say. Automation, which is certainly not artificial intelligence. Anyway, systems do not correct themselves without pain. No one can predict when this crisis will start, but it is clear to many, including the New York Times, that a reckoning is coming. It's just a matter of when. For the average investor, things are changing quickly, and it can be confusing. We've not had such high interest rates in such a long time. I'm sure many have forgotten what to do in this environment. While I'm no financial expert, I highly recommend you consider talking to your financial advisor about these changes. And as Taleb recommends, get out of technology plays, especially the most sort of speculative, if you will, likely to be overvalued. Because again, we had this free money boom that enabled all these private equity firms and venture capital firms and places like SoftBank to just throw money at technology companies to see what sticks, because it didn't cost them very much at all. Look out for those. And then look out for real estate and potentially even the stock market. Think about this. When things like CDs or treasuries and other long-term low-risk plays are now paying yields of 5% or more, consider weathering the coming storm like your grandparents or maybe even your parents used to do. It's time to de-risk your nest egg before the fall. Next, we want to turn to racism and Black Lives Matter and the toxic state of race politics in America. Racism and Black Lives Matter have become the third whale of political discourse. Look no further than the recent controversy at TED Talks, where Coleman Hughes, who I can't say enough good things about, go to thecountry.news. I recommend his Substack. You can get some extra goodies if you subscribe to him and me at the same time. Check it out. He presented a talk about race to a TED Talk in which he advocated for the sensible policy of colorblindness as a general rule. But elements entrenched in the currently accepted race ideology caused major problems with this talk, and the controversy continues. You can read about it, again, at thecountry.news or even better at his website. I highly recommend his TED Talk, his writings, and his podcast. He's an excellent young thinker and has helped me understand this issue much better. He happens to be an African-American young man, and so, it's good for old white guys like me to hear his perspective. More recently, the BLM movement has come under additional scrutiny. And this is really what made me start to think about this. As some members of it seem to justify the murder of more than 1,000 innocents by Hamas in southern Israel. So let's turn to some polling and data. Gallup has been tracking race relations for years. While generally most believe race relations were very or somewhat good between 2001 and 2013. Look at the data. Look at this thing. Right up there. Goes down. Okay? Polling started to tank in 2013. After years at around 70% positive, according to whites, and about 60% according to blacks, 60% of black people believed race relations were somewhat or very positive in 2013. It's dropped. Now it's 43% white people think it's good and 33% black. That's as of 2021. What happened? This move in polling correlates to a move in media as well. Hasn't been as well reported, but over this same time, and slightly preceded by the drop in the polling, stories about racism, racists, white privilege, and racial equity have increased dramatically in our media. Among the worst examples, there's a story from the New York Magazine entitled America's Enduring Caste System, which makes sure to compare modern America to Nazi Germany. The increase in stories like this began around the same time that Black Lives Matter movement started, after Trayvon Martin was killed and George Zimmerman was acquitted. Have race relations really deteriorated? Is the situation for Black Americans worse than it was just 10 years ago? That's really hard to say. So let's take a look at some data and see what we find. One of the longest running polls on race relations in America is also from Gallup. Since 1958, Gallup has been asking Americans whether they approve of interracial marriages. Well, this question is certainly not the only way to measure, the best way to measure race relations. It's the one we have. It's the only source of data we have that goes all the way back to the 50s to compare over such a long time period. And look at the data. The results are really positive. Rising in 1958, 4% of Americans agreed that interracial marriage was okay. In 2021, it was 94%. That's a huge change. And there's really some strange information in the data where white people in 2021 poll slightly higher in approving interracial marriage than non-white people at 96% to 93%. Look at this one. When we look across the world, this is a representation of a poll that was run in 2013. And they asked the question, would you approve of people of another race being your neighbor? And they asked this question in many countries around the world. And you should note the darkest blue countries are the ones that had the least issue with a person of another race living in their neighborhood at 0 to 4.9%. You notice America, Canada, some of South America, Sweden, the UK, Australia. That's about the extent of 0 to 5%. The rest of Europe, the places they polled in Africa, the Middle East, all of Asia, very different. The USA comes in as one of the most tolerant countries in the world. Again, much more so than almost all of Europe and the rest of the world. And this is where it gets interesting, and I may lose some folks. I'm going to talk about racism and policing. I might lose you. I don't know. But I want to preface this next section with, sorry, I had to fix my screen there. I want to preface this with saying a few things that I think are important to say and that hopefully everybody can agree with. There's too much police brutality in America. Every time an incident involving suspects and police in which someone ends up injured or dead is a tragedy. And the truth is there was likely a tragic mistake by either or both the cops and the suspects that caused that tragedy. One thing that's been very good about what the BLM movement has brought is the increase in body cam usage and the available footage, both to make sure the cops are doing things right, but to also make sure the witnesses are telling the truth. One thing that most folks don't understand is qualified immunity. It enables abuse by police. It should be ended. And racism, it exists. As I've shown you in those stats, I think it's very much less than it was even 50 or 60 years ago, but of course it exists. We must be vigilant to its abuses. And then finally, police and police unions sometimes abuse their positions. Happens many times. And the police unions, quite honestly, could do more to help weed out their bad actors. Unfortunately, though, there is nothing in the data that shows police shoot black people at a higher rate due to racial bias. Let me say that again. There is absolutely nothing in the data that shows police shoot black people at a higher rate due to racial bias. In other words, the premise of Black Lives Matter is false. Having read Coleman Hughes' work on this, which I am liberally borrowing from, he writes the next bit better than I can. So the rest, this is a quote from him. For every black person killed by the police, there is at least one white person, and usually many, killed in a similar way. The day before cops in Louisville barged into Breonna Taylor's home and killed her, cops barged into the home of a white man named Duncan Lemp, killed him, and wounded his girlfriend who was sleeping beside him. Even George Floyd, whose death was particularly brutal, has a white counterpart, Tony Timpa. Timpa was killed in 2016 by a Dallas police officer who used his knee to pin Timpa to the ground, face down, for 13 minutes. In the video, you can watch it. You can hear Timpa whimpering and begging to be let go. After he lets out his final breaths, the officers begin cracking jokes about him. Criminal charges initially brought against them were later dropped. At a gut level, it's hard for most people to feel the same level of outrage when the cops kill a white person. Perhaps that is as it should be. After all, for most of American history, it was white suffering that provoked more outrage. But I would submit that if this new quote-unquote anti-racist bias is justified, if we now have a moral obligation to care more about certain lives than others based on skin color or based on racial historical blood guilt, then everything that I thought I knew about basic morality and everything the world's philosophical and religious traditions have been saying about common humanity, about the negatives of revenge and the importance of forgiveness since antiquity, should be thrown out the window. That's an end quote. And then, you can say, yes, but black people are still shot at a proportion much higher than their population. That's true. Blacks make up about 14% of the U.S. population, but the people that are shot by cops are black about 35% of the time. It's more than double, 2.5 times. Certainly, this proves a racial component, right, Coleman? Wrong. Here, back to Coleman Hughes, this is a quote by him. By that logic, you could prove that police shootings were extremely sexist by pointing out that men comprise 50% of the population, or thereabouts, but 93% of unarmed Americans shot by cops are men. Instead, who could investigate and come to a conclusion about such a complex issue with just one variable? What is the color of your skin and were you shot? 2 variables. It's a simpleton's argument. Instead, and that was a quick aside. Let me go back to Coleman here. Instead, you must do what all good social scientists do. Control for confounding variables to isolate the effect that one variable has upon another. In this case, we want to isolate the variables, the effect of a suspect's race on a cop's decision to pull the trigger. At least 4 careful studies have looked at precisely this. One by Harvard economist Roland Fryer, one by a group of public health researchers, one by economist Senthil Mullainathan, and one by David Johnson et al. They're all linked on my article at thecountry.news. You can read them. None of these studies has found a racial bias in deadly shootings. They simply can't find it. Of course, that hardly settles the issues for all time. As always, more research is needed. But given the depth and broadness of 4 different studies already done, it seems unlikely that future work will uncover anything close to the amount of racial bias that BLM protesters in America and around the world believe exists. End quote. Increases in crime equals popularity waning. More recently, after the George Floyd riots and calls for defunding the police reached a crescendo in 2020, the popularity of BLM has waned as crime has increased. A YouGov poll last year showed support for BLM's goals had dropped from 48% at its peak to 31%. This has coincided with an increase in crime, which, right or wrong, has been associated to the defund the police movement pushed by BLM and its supporters. So this past weekend, I got into a little social media scuffle, a dust-up, if you will. I'm one to do it. And I was told that one does not joke about BLM. I'm sorry, but I live in America. One jokes about everything. I found it quite unsettling. If the criticism had been that the joke wasn't that good, I would have agreed. I would have deleted it and moved on, right? Like if that's your and it wasn't that great a joke, honestly. So yeah, more power to you. Would have moved on. But when topics in society become verboten, which is a German word, which means forbidden, you can bet that there's an underlying narrative that reinforces an unhealthy ideology that's not interested in truth. This is one of the reasons why the freedom to speak is the most important right of any functioning society. And as an aside, I sort of made that point in this little dust-up I was talking about. Somebody said, the freedom of speech is only about the government arresting you for saying something. And, that is entirely false. It is a fundamental misunderstanding of our theory of rights and government. And you need only go back to the Declaration of Independence and read that we are endowed by our Creator with rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. John Locke said pursuit of property, but same thing. John Locke kind of informed, and some others informed a lot of what Jefferson wrote. Our rights are endowed by our Creator, and that men create governments to secure those rights. Okay? What do I mean? The Constitution does not limit me or my rights. Those rights are endowed by our Creator, by nature, if you will, by the universe, if you will. If you don't believe in God, fine, whatever. And the government doesn't get to take them away. The First Amendment doesn't limit my right to speak. It limits the government, as does the entire Constitution. The Constitution limits the government's rights, not mine. So let's just stop saying silly things like freedom of speech only means that the government can't arrest you for talking. I am free to speak, period, full stop. And look, I just went really serious there. I'm no martyr, okay? Like, it's just a stupid, social media thing. But I'm going to fight for my right to say stupid things and write stupid jokes as long as I am able. Let the chips fall. So now we're going to continue on, because the final question for Black Lives Matter is, why don't Black Lives matter? The BLM movement ignores at least 97% of all Black murders. So let's look at it. In 2021, 233 Black Americans were shot and killed by police. And while the data is hard to come by and likely fraught with error, the Washington Post database, they keep a database on police shootings, reports 23 unarmed Black Americans were shot by police in 2018. To be clear, every one of these deaths is a tragedy. But would you be surprised to learn that in 2021, that same year where there were 233 Black Americans shot by police, there were 8,488 homicides of Black Americans. In fact, the police shootings, of which the vast majority were probably justified, they may have been justified, still only represents, if they were all murders, they'd only represent 3% of Black people murdered in America for that year. And the unarmed shootings, where it becomes quite questionable whether it's justified by police, would make up only 0.3% of those homicides. The FBI crime database reports that more than 52,000 of homicides in 2021 were committed by blacks. And according to USA Today, 93% of black murders were perpetrated by blacks. 93% of the people murdered who happened to be black were murdered by black people. So the data shows there's a very serious problem of blacks committing murder and being murdered in America. But the focus has been solely on the very small number of shootings committed by police, rather than fatal shootings of blacks committed by their fellow citizens. If your goal were to save black lives, wouldn't you focus on the 97% rather than the 0.3%? One argument to this question reads something like this. When a citizen commits a crime, they are very much more likely to be arrested and go to jail than a police officer. While there's some evidence this is true, it's much more complicated than that. See, police officers, as we talked about earlier, are granted qualified immunity in the line of duty, which means, it's a practice that many people, including myself, think should end. They accidentally shoot somebody wrongly, they should be held accountable. But that's not the current law of the land. It gives sovereign immunity protections, not entirely, not completely, but it gives them some protections for officers who make mistakes in the general line of duty. This is likely the proximal cause of the very numerous police acquittals and non-prosecutions. I think it should end. And I'm glad BLM brought that to my attention and to the attention of many people. But even worse, more than 50% of murders, especially in big cities, go unsolved. More than 50% of murders in America go unsolved. In Chicago, one of the worst places for murder in America, the rate has dipped recently into the 30% range. Only 30% of murders are solved. Part of this can be attributed to shrinking resources at police departments, ironically brought on in part by the BLM movement to defund the police, among other budget cuts. But experts will tell you it is also due to the lack of witness participation. There's this awful negative feedback loop due to a lack of trust. So police are unable to solve murders because witnesses are unwilling to trust them with information. If somebody comes up to you, if a police officer comes up to you and there was a murder in your building and you know who did it and they live in the building too, if you don't trust the cops that they're going to execute that arrest and get that person out of your building, you're not going to trust them with that information. In part because, you don't trust them to solve the crime. But the net effect is that in some neighborhoods across America, murders occur regularly without much being done about it by witnesses or police because of that negative feedback loop. And then strangely, at the website for the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, they have a list of major policy objectives. Here's the strange part. Let me tell you what they are. Defunding the police, pretrial reform, anti-voter suppression, police oversight, Medicare for all, demilitarize the police, Supreme Court democracy reform, DC statehood, ending the filibuster, and criminal justice. 3 of these topics address police brutality, at least the 3%. And the other 7 topics are progressive policy goals unrelated to directly saving black lives at all. And by the way, we should have more police oversight and we should demilitarize the police. So I agree with you on those 2. But there is not one mention of the thousands of murdered black people murdered by black people that is punishing the community. There's not one mention of the illegal drug trade, gang violence, lack of educational opportunities, and breakdown of the family that's transpired in the past 60 years. in the black community especially, but in America generally too. You cannot solve a problem until you've identified the causes. And in the case of Black lives murdered, racist cops don't even register on the map. Let's go ahead and look at another chart. I'm sure this chart will upset some folks because it is percentage of U.S. births outside of wedlock by major group. One of the hypotheses that I think needs some attention is the breakdown of the family in the American community, in the American society. And you can see it here. In 1964, it looks like a little less than 25% of black babies were born out of wedlock. By 2014, it was over 70%. And that's true of Hispanics. It's true of whites. The total goes from 8%, 7-8% in 1964 to about 40%. 40% of children in 2014 were born out of wedlock. It's probably much higher now, would be my guess. And, you know, I'm not going to get into a big diatribe about this issue, but it is a contributing factor, I believe, and perhaps we'll have another podcast about it at another time. Here's our next chart, and this is from the CDC. This is a chart of the leading cause of death for, in this case, non-Hispanic black males by age group. And the first two age groups are 1 to 19 years old, and the second is 20 to 44 years old. And homicide is the number one cause of death for non-Hispanic black males in those two categories. It's just earth-shattering. So we've got a few other charts up on the country.news in this this article. You know, it shows that white wealth has grown significantly over that same time period, while black wealth has pretty much remained stagnant. And it also shows that despite whatever level of sort of cost or wealth in an educational environment, lowest unperforming, fair, good, very good, or exemplary sort of schools, and this is in Washington State, the achievement gap remains the same. So these are jaw-dropping statistics with deep, complicated causes that cannot be explained with a basic single answer like systemic racism. Indeed, the United States, while still imperfect, and probably will always be imperfect, what's perfect? We're humans. We have institutions. Any institution with any amount of folks has its issues. Will always be that way. But the United States has been the greatest experiment in freedom and race relations ever attempted in the history of the world. The U.S. fundamentally created the modern democracy, and it fundamentally created the racial equality movements for the world with its founding documents. The U.S. is the only country to inherit a slave-based economy. We inherited that economy from the European monarchies, the Spanish Kingdom Empire, the British Empire, and others. They imported colonists from their own countries and other countries, and slaves from other places, mostly Africa, obviously, long before the USA was born. So we're the first country that had inherited such an evil system and fought a civil war to stop it and to free slaves living in our country. No one has ever done that, ever, before or since. The greatest documents that encapsulate the freedom movement for all people across the world are, to this day, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That's one from each century for the last three. There is still so much to fix. But no country ever has done more to attempt to right the wrongs of the treatment of its people, especially in regard to slavery and race. So there's no simple solutions to where we go from here, but we need to start at the very least to ask the right questions, which again seems to be verboten in America. I'm going to ask them anyway. Let the chips fall, as I said before. Here's my list of questions for the Black Lives Movement. Why is the leading cause of death for black boys and men ages 1 to 44 homicide? Why are 70% of black children born out of wedlock? What part of the poor education options available in many black communities contribute to the larger problems of wealth, family, and homicides? For that matter, what part of the poor education options available in many black communities is directly tied to the unions who represent the teachers and principals, to the local school boards and local governments that run them? Why do black leaders seemingly never discuss the single greatest problem for black lives, which is homicide within the community? How can Black Lives Matter and other organizations partner with police and local governments to build relationships, to build dialogue, and to build trust so that people will tell police what happened and we can start solving more of these murders and get those awful villains off the streets? Is defunding the police good or bad for the black community? If you agree that the problem has many causes and has gone unsolved for decades, what new options and alliances within the system could you pursue for meaningful change? I'd like some answers. I'd like to have a discussion. If you know anybody that's a BLM supporter or even works for one of those organizations, please have them reach out. I'd love to talk about it with them. I want dialogue. One thing's for sure, though, if there's any hope in building a better future for black lives, we have to start asking these sorts of questions. What other questions should we be asking? Reach out and let us know.
Hey, all right, it's the country. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Justin Weller. You know, here we rely on premium subscribers to produce this show and all of our content. If you like what we're doing, would you consider heading over to www.thecountry.news, where you can become a premium subscriber for just $5 a month. Please also subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this show, and follow us on the X, where you'll find us under the handle @JWTheCountry. Thanks so much.